Good morning, everybody. Hey, Susan, how are you?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Okay, we're not having any banter today. We are going to dig in. This is serious stuff. It's dry. It's a bunch of edu-speak, but it is extremely important because it impacts kids and families. And we know we have a problem here in Sarasota. The school board members voted 5-0 to have a company come in, and they did a 98-page, $150,000 no bid contract to overview and do what they said to be a deep dive into ESE. In the last podcast, we told you what they proposed digging into and how they proposed digging in. And shall we kick it off, Susan, with the superintendent introducing the speakers and the report?
Yes, that's perfect.
All right, here we go. Maybe here we go.
Presentation is the ESE presentation. Mr. Connor, if you'd like to introduce our guest today.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my honor to introduce Exceptional Learning Solutions, Dr. Bambi Lockman and Todd Zolik, who are here as a part of an agreement that this board made in terms of a programmatic review of our ESE department. Prior to my arrival, the board approved that contract with Exceptional Learning Solutions. And over the course of several months, I think beginning in September, this process started that gave a deep dive into our ESE department. And there are some great findings that came through as a result of that review. And we have our representatives here today, Bambi and Todd, who are going to walk us through those findings and recommendations. And we look forward to this as a part of the blueprint for our upcoming refresh strategic plan about how we can deliver exceptional service in our exceptional education department. So I'll hand it over to you, and you may begin. Thank you.
Thank you.
So what I'll say about that, Susan, is what I just heard is you all contracted with these people before I got here. And I'm going to give you 3 hours today to let them present to me. But the interesting part to me was he's going to use this as part of the blueprint for the strategic plan, which we've seen the marketing piece for the strategic plan. I'm not sure that we've seen the plan. But what I will say, the mantra we always say about the school board is watch what they say, watch what they do, not what they say. Watch what they do, not what they say. So we hear what they're doing, but let's dig into this proposal, this report. Susan, what do you think?
Well, give me just a minute and we're going to bring it up so everybody at home can see it too. And so the first thing that I just want to remind everybody is when this was delivered to the school district. So it's the Special Education Program Review Report. It is available online. If you want to read it yourself, you can go to the school board website and you can find it among the documents provided for the public review in conjunction with the workshop where it was delivered on November 28th, 2023. So it's been about 7 months or so since this information has been available for the school board members and the superintendent to review and consider and decide whether or not they're going to incorporate it into the new strategic plan that this superintendent is bringing forward. And we've had a few of those in the past with other superintendents. And, sometimes implementation starts and then we get a new superintendent and they go in a different direction or they, change things up. So it will be interesting to see, they just gave a new contract to the superintendent for the next 5 years. And he's got a 5-year strategic plan that he's just bringing forward to the public that we haven't, again, as Sue said, we've seen the marketing pieces of kind of what's in it, but we haven't seen the detail level. So we aren't going to really address deeply whether these things made it into his new plan or not, because we haven't seen the public. We, the public, have not seen all the details of that yet. That's
Similar to the budget.
Yeah.
So the
the budget,
priorities,
the elusive budget.
the elusive budget. Yeah. We see pieces of it. We pretend they show it, but we don't see it.
So just to remind folks, what did they look at in this report? What
Can you make that bigger or no?
I can make us disappear.
That doesn't do much.
And,
Okay, thanks.
I think that's about as big as I can get it.
That's perfect.
Okay. So reminding folks, what did they look at? They looked at 10 areas, the ESE department and the organization of the department. Then they looked at staffing for ESE. They looked at the finance and budget of how we pay for things in the ESE area. They looked at the programmatic offerings and the continuum of service. And I just want to say that for parents who are listening to this, the meat of what you see in your classrooms, really, we get into that in section 4 of this report. Then we look at policies and procedures, which we always think are important because those are like the rules of the game. Curriculum and instruction. This is vital. If we want students to make achievement, we have to have appropriate curriculum and instruction happening in our classrooms. The teachers need to know how to deliver it. They need to have the resources that are recommended. So again, this is front of the classroom kind of stuff. Then we have data, one of Sue's favorite topics. Transitions. And transitions are when a student is moving from perhaps pre-K to kindergarten, or they're moving from middle school to high school, and in the law, transition usually is talking about when students are moving from high school to the world. Then we have training and professional development. So hopefully we're making sure people know what they're doing. And then finally, the last thing that they looked at were parents and community relations. And if I'm being cynical here, it kind of, parents are the last on the list, and sometimes we feel that way. Okay, so any other thoughts on what's in the overview of the report, Sue?
Well, the only comment I would have assured the school board at the presentation of what they were going to dive into, that it would be a deep dive, it would be very thorough. If they needed more information, they were going to go get it. And there were certain topics they said they were going to cover. And we'll have more comment at that at the end of this once we go through it. And we're not going to read this to you word for word. That would be even more boring than us talking about it. But you guys can go get it. You can go to the school board agenda. This is back up on the November, what was the date, Susan? Workshop?
November 28th.
Right. So you can go get it. You can download it and you can read anything you'd like about it. We're just going to hit some highlights and try to get through it as quickly as we can with the pieces we feel are important to help you understand our perspective.
And I stopped for a second just on the 2 presenters that brought this forward to the school board, that were the representatives from the company that they hired. And just a reminder, anybody that maybe didn't catch our last show, but the first person that was a speaker was Dr. Bambi Lockman. And what I think is important in her resume for our purposes is that she was the chief of the Bureau of Exceptional Education and Student Services in the Florida Department of Ed from 2004 to 2011. And so if you'll recall, special education law, IDEA, changed in 2004 federally. And at the time of implementing the new law, which is still the current law, Dr. Lockman was in charge of that implementation throughout the state of Florida.
So she was the boss lady. She was absolutely the top of the pyramid for ESE for the state.
Correct. And then the other thing that I think is really important that we're still have in our schools is MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, which was that was a new concept coming in 2004, where we were, instead of just using psychological reports to determine students' disability needs, we started looking at what interventions could we put in place in classrooms and how did the student respond to those interventions. And then if they didn't respond, we started to look at special education. It was a new model of how we were serving students, but I just want to, that was 2004. It is 2024. So here we are 2 decades later. It's not new now. And I just think that's important for people to keep in mind. The other presenter is Todd Zolik, Esquire. So he is an attorney, an author, an educator. He has a variety of things he's done, but what I thought was interesting is during that same time period of 2005 to 2009, so this implementation of new federal law, his role was that he was the deputy regional secretary at the U.S. Department of Education. So he was appointed by George W. Bush, and he was in Margaret Spelling's education department. So both of these folks were in positions of administration at very high levels as this new law and this new way of providing special education was coming to be across the country and specifically in the state of Florida. Okay, so we talked about the methodology and process of how they collected information and what they were doing in the last podcast. So I'm going to skip past all of that and talk about today we're going to try to get through as many of these categories as we can and give you guys the information. So if you watch the workshop.
Can I ask you just to back up one screen?
Yep.
Because I think something on page 9 is really important that this community needs to know. And what I'd like this community to know is we had some board members that were concerned about having enough meetings because of the parent responses and understanding we've got a problem here in Sarasota. And what I think is important here is they sent out to staff 3,951 surveys, and only 245 responded.
Which is a really low number.
Mm-hmm. And then when you go down the surveys, and they were sent in different languages, English, Spanish, Russian, Ukrainian, they sent 10,037 emails to parents in July. And what they wanted to get was, how was your school year? What are your thoughts? And 173 parents responded, and 9,214 emails sent in October of 23, 73 surveys were returned. Those responses are abysmal. We've got a culture problem here in Sarasota, and the fact that they aren't, our school board isn't figuring out how to engage, communicate, and build trust. You're going to hear a lot of that during this report. It is a huge problem, in my opinion. What are your thoughts, Susan?
I agree. And, just to keep giving sort of the landscape that they found when they came here, is they also did some in-person parent meetings. They did 2 of them. And again, the school board members wondered, was that enough? But of those 2 meetings, only 13 people showed up.
It's a trust.
Correct. And that was what the consultants interpreted that to mean, is that there was a cultural problem and that parents were not trusting of the district office in particular. And so they didn't find that showing up for meetings was going to be meaningful to them. There wasn't enough value for parents to take time to come talk about it. And having been in this community a very long time, and certainly we've been to plenty of these parent meetings and we've hosted a fair number of them. When people don't come, they don't think that it's worth their time, that anything is going to result from showing up.
Well, and think about it. With the last superintendent, we did a whole bunch of meetings and parents felt their voices weren't heard. And it's been years of, we just need this to happen first, and we need 4 votes on the school board, or we need, who knows what we need. There's always some deflection. But to your point, Susan, back when we were involved in schools, we could fill a room of parents and we would have meaningful conversation, and they would always tell us, we don't feel like there's two-way communication with the schools and the district office. So clearly that's gotten worse, not better, through the years, just looking at the results of this.
Right. So I would say, if we're going to offer our viewpoint on this report, there was not much in this that was shocking to me. It was validating, I believe, of what we encounter when we're in schools, and sort of the trajectory that we've watched happen over the years of being involved, particularly in special education in Sarasota.
Right. We want your money. We don't want your voice.
And so the
So
other thing
I'm sorry to deflect you. The meat and the potatoes, the framework.
So I think the other piece that's important, since we stopped here, is that they did go on site to 11 schools. And those schools that they visited were Brentwood Elementary, Fruitville L, Gardnell, Glen Allen Elementary, Heron Creek Middle School, McIntosh Middle, Oak Park School, Riverview High, Southside Elementary, Tatum Ridge L, and Venice High School. So those were sample schools. It represented 25% of the schools in Sarasota County, and they felt like they got a good sampling of how services were being delivered. They talked to teachers, they talked to building administrators. So, I would say we have been in all of those schools personally. We've done IEP meetings. I think I probably have done IEP meetings at all of those schools over the years. And I would say that they represent a good broad section of what we see across the county.
And the last thing important to note here is everything you just heard from Susan and I verbalizing in this report was not presented publicly at the school board meeting or workshop that they presented this. It's all in the body of the report. It's all in the details, but none of this discussion transpired publicly at the meeting.
Yep. So when we move to the first category, which is the ESE department and organization, I just want to talk a little bit about the structure of the report. So what they did is they had a category and a topic, and then the first thing they did was give commendation, what they felt was good in Sarasota about this area. And we always want to celebrate things that are working. However, today we're not going to take the time to read those to you. They're all in the report. So if you want to see what's working in each one of these areas, you can go check out the commendations. If this was a big area that they were going through, they broke it down into smaller sections that they call focus areas. And so, like for the first one, it's focus area 1.1, and they're looking at the organizational structure of the school district. And so they have a few more areas that they talk about under the ESE department and organization. At the end of each of these focus areas, once they tell you what the problem is, then they offer a recommended solution. And at the very end of the report, they gather all of the solutions they've offered from throughout the report, and they categorize them by, here's the things you can do in the first 6 months. Here's the things you can do in a year. Here's the things we might take you 2 years to get to. So when you go to read the report, just know that's how it's laid out. Anything to add there, Sue?
Nope.
Okay. So the first thing that they talked about in the report is how special education and student services are structured in Sarasota County currently. And this changed, how long ago do you think, Sue?
It changed. Tom Edwards was on the board, Bridget Ziegler, Karen Rose. That was when they promoted the former director of student services to an executive director position under a separate silo.
Like 2019, 2020, somewhere in that.
I think even a little, well, it was after, what was the first, it was after either the first or the second DJ case. It was during that time.
Right. So we got a ruling on the first case in October of 2019.
Okay.
So it would have been, that's why I'm saying late 19 or sometime in 2020, I think this change happened.
Right.
And why that's important to know is in Sarasota County, up until that point, student services and the ESE department were under the same leadership and reporting structure. Those two departments were together. And why we bring that up is because one of the recommendations that they make is that, so currently, I should back up, student services was sort of split off and it was put under a different reporting structure than ESE at that time. And one of the organizational recommendations that this report makes is to bring those two departments back together because they're so programmatically integrated.
Right. It was Brennan Asplin that made that change. And it was during while the state had Sarasota under monitoring. I remember trying to talk to the school board members to better understand it, and I never really did get a clear answer.
So anyway, when we go through the focus area number 1, let me get to, there's 6 pages in this area. And so there is a chief academic officer. It's the deputy superintendent position currently. That is the chief academic officer. That is where the ESE service hierarchy falls under currently. There's also a chief of staff that reports to the superintendent, and student services is under that umbrella currently. So and then there's directors that report up to the ESE executive director currently at the time of this report. When I say currently, I mean currently as of November of 2023.
And that's what I was going to say. All these chief positions are new with the new superintendent, approved by this current school board. So the school board has to approve positions and salaries and the associated budget, which you'll get sick of me saying that word. But all these chiefs are new positions in a new structure. And why this is important, it's like the framework. It's the framework of your car. If you don't have a good framework, the wheels are going to fall off. So that's why I think Bambi and Todd spent so much time talking about the framework and its importance in the interrelation between the successful outcomes for student achievement and curriculum and learning.
And it's important to know that if you'll recall, anybody that listened to the last podcast, this report was commissioned under an interim superintendent. It was then delivered under the current superintendent. And when some of the charts that you'll see incorporated some of the changes that the new superintendent had already put in place by the time the report was delivered. What he had been in that seat, I think they said like around 90 days when this report was delivered. So again, it was sort of a work in progress that they were watching as this company was trying to evaluate what was happening in Sarasota. So when I say currently, it gets a little confusing sometimes, but know that everything that's in this report is what was in place as of November 28th of 2023. Okay. So what else do we need to know about this? So they did propose some changes. One of the things that they recommended were 2 senior level positions be added to the org chart, reporting to that deputy superintendent. They recommended a chief of pupil support services and then a executive director of ESE and student services that would have 3 directors reporting to the executive director, one of student services, one of ESE, and one of preschool.
So they,
And go ahead.
I was just going to say they kind of funneled the hierarchy of the chain of command in a different level, but they made it very clear that they felt that the outcomes were the important part, academics were the most important part, and the unison of the 2 silos needed to be reconnected in order to have achievement advance in Sarasota County.
Absolutely. And again, having student services is where the MTSS is housed, and ESE is where special education is housed. And those 2 things for students that are struggling learners should be connected, because you should seamlessly be able to move from interventions, if they're not working, to consideration for special education and perhaps services if necessary within that same education structure. There shouldn't be a disconnect between those departments and how they operate.
Right. And I'm not sure that we're going to get to the MTSS section today, but as we go through this, keep in mind every time we say MTSS, there's a school board member that was responsible during her career here in Sarasota at the district level office. Her job was oversight of MTSS and implementation of MTSS. And the people that were responsible for implementing it are also still within the district. And that was, Susan, how many years ago?
Oh, I lose track of the timeline, but I mean, MTSS implementation began at least in 2006, and it may have been slightly earlier than that. But I can remember, like, I was a parent liaison for the school district in 2006, and I remember sitting in rooms learning about how to implement MTSS.
Right. And they would always tell us, be patient. It's a slow moving ship. But I mean, the ship is sinking. And we've got people sitting at that school board level that understand this stuff and the importance of it. And another spoiler alert, what's going to be the meat and potatoes of this report is the conversation that takes place during it and the questions that are asked or not asked when the report is concluded. So just keep that in mind, that we've got school board members who are intimately involved. Their entire career was spent doing this work.
And what I feel like the contractors came back and said, like, one of the things that resonated with me is that they wanted people to have here's the word, linchpin between upper administration and the directors. And I think what I take away from that is at upper administration levels, you're really looking at policy and finance and how do all those things intersect. But by the time you get to the director level, you're looking at how does all of that translate into implementation in our buildings, in our classrooms. And they wanted to make sure there wasn't a disconnect between what the intention was from the superintendent and their cabinet and the strategic plan, and then what is actually happening in our classrooms. When you have, I don't know, 5,000 employees roughly, making sure everybody understands the mission and is serving children for achievement outcomes takes work to get everybody on the same page. And it really seemed to me that the structure that was being recommended was to make sure that happened.
Right. Well, and they did that because they saw problems with what was currently happening, which you're going to get to.
Yeah. So the other thing that they talked about here was at the district level and at school building level, some structural changes with the people that aren't directly in the classrooms, but who support people in the classrooms. And so they were recommending that program specialists and ESE liaisons, which are positions that already exist in Sarasota, be revamped because there was an extreme focus on compliance. And it's because there were lawsuits and there were an inspector general finding and then monitoring and compliance requirements by the Florida Department of Education that Sarasota was under and met whatever benchmarks they set. And it's now been reduced from that monitoring at this point. But they said we spent so much time focusing on compliance that we weren't really focused on student achievement. That was sort of an afterthought. And I would say that we could see that in IEP meetings we attended with families.
Right, but the caveat to that is, and Karen Rose said it at the meeting, they only went back 5 years. However, this achievement gap and this problem has existed for many years in Sarasota, a growing gap. So while we want to say we only focused on compliance, I would agree that we focused more on compliance, but does that mean the people running the meetings understood what the compliance should be? You'll see later in the report, I think that answer is often also no.
I agree. I just think that their point was at the leadership level, that leadership was so worried about dotting I's and crossing T's and checking boxes.
Right.
They weren't paying attention to what is happening to our children in their classrooms. It wasn't
Amen to that.
took your eye off the ball, that the whole point of all of this is so that our children can read and write and do math and make their way in the world. And if
Right.
that isn't what we're achieving, then the rest of it doesn't really matter. So anyway, back to your point, we had a significantly low achievement gap between gen ed students and special education students. They go into that a lot in category 7. We won't get there today, but we'll talk about that more. And so they want this structure, this change, to really focus on student achievement first. So 2 responsibilities for program specialists. Right now, they are not able to spend enough time that is needed in school buildings because they're so busy. They call it compliance issues. I'd say running around putting out fires.
Yep, they said that too.
Yeah. They should be able to help drive student achievement among special ed students by supporting teachers and liaisons. And again, ESE liaisons, believe me, I know as a parent, when my kids were in the school, I was so happy to have an ESE liaison that I could call, that central point of contact. But we've seen they spend so much time just like making sure the IEPs are written that there's no time for them to help with implementation. Okay, so let's keep going. One of the things that they said is that there was a lack of administrative oversight for the program specialist. So we had them running around doing stuff, but there wasn't really a cohesive plan of what their role was and what they needed to be working towards. The next thing that I think is really important, and again, we see this over and over again, that people do not have the training or the knowledge that they need at the ESE liaison level to be an effective coach, trainer, or model in the classroom. very seldom did we see liaisons in classrooms. They were always in IEP meetings and running meetings with people, not really working directly with teachers.
Well, and in the way it's set up, because the ESE liaisons report to the leadership in their schools. They don't report up through the district. And we would often hear from ESE liaisons, look, I'm trying to get this teacher to do what they know the teacher should be doing, but I'm not that teacher's boss. And it's that hierarchy that's a little bit askew as far as how it currently is situated. Well, how maybe it currently is situated. We haven't seen the most recent org chart, but yeah, it's a difficult position to be in, and they do a good job. But the training that they used to get is not the training that they still get. So it's sad, because parents will walk into a meeting and they're walking in thinking that they're walking into a meeting of people, the experts in the room, and sometimes that isn't the case.
So one of the structural changes that's being recommended is that there be district level compliance liaisons, that is their sole focus, is to make sure that the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and that we're following the rules and regulations, and that program specialists and ESC liaisons become more subject matter experts, and they're supporting the people in the buildings, kids in the classrooms, and making sure that we're focused on student achievement at that level. And I think that I will be interested to see if that makes a difference. I would hope it would.
Well, if they do it, we don't know yet how this is going to look and how it's going to roll out. We used to have a program specialist that was in charge of compliance, and that role was taken very seriously, and that person was always called upon when there were questions related to compliance. To have multiple people responsible for compliance in different areas, it will be interesting to see how that rolls out.
Right. And I would think that this director level position that they're recommending, if that happens, would take on that role of being, the compliance expert and directing what happens with compliance, and how the program specialist would be the people helping to implement, or not the program specialist, the compliance specialist being
Right.
able to implement that. So we'll have to see. We have not seen this happen yet.
Well, what we have seen is the most recent org chart that's out there. The director was promoted to an executive director. There was a job posting for the director position. And you'll see later in the recommendations that there's an issue with postings and how the clarity of the job. So it will be interesting to see what that job posting consists of and who's hired for that role.
So just to sum up, the first recommendation that they made was to adopt the proposed organizational chart developed by this company, rename and or restructure existing positions under new supervisors, and hire new positions as soon as practicable. So that's the end of focus area 1. Focus area 2, I feel, is extremely important: culture and climate. And I'm going to scroll up a little bit so we can see the chart. And so they asked, here, I'm sorry, I got distracted for a minute. It's vitally important to maintain positive morale among staff. And so, do you feel you're supported in your job? And I think everybody was a little concerned to see that only 60% of people who responded to the survey felt like they were supported in their job. And so they broke that down to look at, well, if people don't feel supported, where's the breakdown? And so they asked another question about building administration versus district administration. And I'm going to scroll down again.
And while she's scrolling, I think it's important, none of this stuff was presented publicly. The details that we're talking about, the only thing that they presented was the recommendations.
And so when they looked at building administration, so this would be like the principal, the assistant principals, 73% of teachers said, yes, we feel like, or staff, we are supported by our building administrators. And they did say we aren't surprised that the number would be higher with building administrators because they see those people every day. I mean, if staff has a problem or a question, that would be the first person they would go to, and hopefully they're getting the answers that they need to do their job. But then they said, well, how do you feel about what you get from district administration? And those numbers changed dramatically. 52.1% of people said we do not feel we're getting sufficient support from district administration.
That's awful. And it's shocking. And their words were, it's a tremendous cause for concern for Sarasota. And what we're doing is amping up district staff. On steroids, we're getting district staff people in. So hopefully this is something they're going to take seriously.
Yep. And so let's see, did they?
Well, what they said is the two cause for concern was the lack of trust in special education district administration and a lack of visibility. As you said, Susan, they feel like they just see the district people show up when there's a fire to be put out, or I think Todd's words were a high profile IEP meeting, whatever that means. And I think that's probably concerning for staff, because if they don't understand how they got to where they aren't going to be able to correct it next time.
Right. So one of the charges that this report made for this new chief that they recommended of pupil support services was an opportunity to adjust the culture and climate by building trust and rapport with staff. And,
Right.
When staff gets, I think a lot of this comes back to, and they talk about this at some point in the report, communication, information, training. I mean, it's not rocket science. We know how to do this. It's making sure that we are doing it.
Well, and going back to the beginning, watch what they do, not what they say. They all stand up there and want to talk about how transparent they are, but lack of trust based on many conversations and interviews, and I would say with parents as well as staff, the team that did this report believed that it was due to insufficient transparency. That's a problem.
Right. And it's right there on page 18.
Yep.
It's they wrote that insufficient transparency is what caused the lack of trust. And so that shared decision making needs to happen. It's funny because I don't know if it's still true, but forever at schools we had something called SDMT, shared decision making team. And it was a place where the principals brought whatever was happening to the staff to get staff input. And it was never perfect. Believe me, I mean, a lot of times I think the same complaint parents had, that it was a one-way communication. Staff would feel that way, but at least there was a structure to have some input on shared decision making. And again, I don't know whether that still happens in the schools or not. But even if it is, based on this report, it's not effective.
There needs to be a clear effort with clear communication and follow through to build some trust here and change the culture for staff and parents. I can't tell you how many parents I've met in the past 6 months moved here for our schools and are pulling their kids out to homeschool. It is just sad and devastating.
So then there was another chart. Do you believe that the Sarasota County School has clear ESE processes and procedures in place that all personnel and schools follow? And 58.6% of people said no.
Wow.
That's huge. I mean, how, if we had so much focus on compliance, then
Right.
how can people believe that we don't have processes and procedures? And again, we're not saying that there aren't processes and procedures. There's a procedure manual. There's layers and layers of rules and regs and the SPNP, it's a document that every district sends into the state to talk about how are we going to implement special education rules in our county. So, I mean, there are just layers and layers of processes and procedures. But if 58.6% of the people who are responsible for implementing them don't believe that they're clear, there's a problem. I mean, that's a problem.
Yep. Yep. These numbers align kind of with our student success numbers.
Yeah, and that is an
Or
interesting
lack thereof.
observation. So I just felt that this was really important. The culture and climate hinge on perceptions of the department's administration and the leadership team. Successful department leaders hold the trust and respect of staff. They need to build relationships with the building administrators and staff, and that they need to be visible. They're not out in those buildings in a way that makes people feel like they're accessible. Again, they're there to put out fires. And so it will be interesting to see as this new school year opens, do we see a shift in the culture? They've identified, they say the first step of creating change is identifying the problem. Well, we now know what the problems are. We have an outside person telling us what they've seen. They've given us recommendations on how to resolve some of these things. Will it actually happen? So recommendation 1.2 was to address the culture and climate issues within the special education in Sarasota, reestablishing trust through transparency of initiatives, discussing the why and how of change, and increasing department administrators' visibility by carving out a few hours each week for in-person on-site visits.
Right. And that doesn't mean like the last superintendent we had that would just run around and make videos on the go. It's meaningful stuff that I think we're looking for the way it used to be in Sarasota, and more of a unity and a collaborative effort as opposed to a finger pointing and this person pitted against that person. That needs to stop.
I think we need less marketing and shiny objects. So we need real substantive work, and it needs to be on the ground implementation directly impacting students, and everything everybody's doing every day, that should be the purpose of it. And if that isn't what it's moving us towards, then you're spending your time on the wrong things.
Absolutely. Well said, Susan.
So the next focus area that they 1.3 was communication. And the way Sue likes to say data, I want to say communication, because 90% of the parents that come to us and are really having struggles with their schools, I'd say more than half of the time it's a communication problem. And we see that from the top down, that we have some, it's a source of frustration. People don't get the information they need in an accurate or timely manner. The communication is inadequate.
Or the people that they're communicating with haven't been instructed appropriately or given the appropriate information to get the right answer. So the communication the parents do receive is either wrong or not complete or pretty off-putting sometimes.
Yep. So how would you rate communication from Sarasota County's school district administration? And it looks like 55.6% of people thought it was excellent. And 36.8 thought it was good. But then we get down to fair and poor, and we're at 33.9 and 21.8. Well, oh, I'm sorry, that they broke out the 55.
That's too much.
I got that wrong.
Where'd you go?
I had wishful thinking happening there. You know what? I think it's because these numbers are really so unbelievable. It was only 75.5% who thought that communication was excellent. 55.6 thought it was fair or poor.
Right.
And as you can tell, visuals are not my specialty. So I couldn't, the color change between dark blue and light blue was so subtle on my computer screen that I thought it must be 55.6% think our communication is good, but it isn't. It's exactly the opposite.
So say again what it is.
So they broke down excellent, good, fair, or poor. How do you rate communication from the district administration? 7.5% of people said excellent. We get excellent communication. 36.8% said it's good, but 55.6% rated communication as fair or poor in the district.
So then they broke down the fair and the poor.
They did, and they broke it down so that you could see, 33.9% said it was fair and 21.8% said it was poor.
Right. And it would be interesting to see what these charts read, because we often see, like when you get ESE questionnaires from the state, it would be like, well, were you included in the meeting? Well, of course they say yes, because they were included. They sent an invitation. But the question isn't, did you feel like you had meaningful participation in the meeting? So
Right.
Understanding the surveys would be interesting.
Right. And so I believed, but I could be wrong, that the question asked was, how would you rate communication?
Right.
Like,
So they
right.
communicate with me. Yeah, they do it. So I've got to say yes.
So communication with staff should not only occur when there are issues to report, changes in initiatives, or staffing updates. They need regular and reliable communication. The quantity and the quality are insufficient for a vast majority of staff, and they're recommending a weekly email newsletter that is clear and concise. It's so they want to make sure people are updated, that they're getting updates about special education laws, rules, and regs, and then things that directly impact teachers and staff and resources. Okay. So then they looked at, again, because they're dividing the district and the building administration, and they asked, what do you think about communication in your building? And then our numbers look a little bit better. 38.2% say we get excellent communication. 30.3% say we get good communication. And then 31.5% were in that good or the poor or fair. And they broke that down further, that 19.5% said we get fair communication and 12% said it's poor. So it's a little better at the building level, but still a third of staff feel like that they don't get good communication from their building administrators. So again, people need to understand the why and the how of what is being asked of them. And I would say they need to understand their role in the mission. And the mission of a school district is to educate children. just to be clear. I mean, I probably am repeating myself here, but we need to keep our eye on that ball. That is why the school district exists.
One would hope.
And here I thought was important. Effective communication is a two-way street, meaning those receiving information must be engaged to hear it and must have an opportunity to respond to it. And I would say a long-standing problem we've seen over many years is the communication comes at you, but there is not usually a mechanism in place for the feedback to go the other direction. So I really hope to see an improvement in that. So recommendation 1.3 was to develop a regular and reliable communication plan with the following components: an annual in-person school year kickoff for staff, for special education staff, where the vision for the school year will be articulated and the staff accomplishments are celebrated. In-person department-wide quarterly meetings throughout the school year to discuss new initiatives, explain the why and the how of changes to policies and procedures, and provide an opportunity for special education staff to ask questions and actively engage in discussion. A substantive weekly email newsletter, which we talked about, and then a process for rolling out new initiative systems, processes, and procedures with in-person meetings, educators being involved in the development, and an explanation of the benefit for students and teachers.
And basically this, if you go back and if you watch this, the presentation, you'll notice that it isn't a practice what you preach approach that happened, because there wasn't a lot of conversation about this. It was delivery of the recommendations, and the details in the issues were not discussed, presented to the board, and there was no conversation about any of this.
Right. And I mean, we just cut to the chase at the end of the meeting. The school board members, although they had their one-on-ones, because we talked about that last time with the presenters before it came out to the public, the school board members had very few questions that they asked. I mean, they had an extra hour's worth of time at the end of the presentation that wasn't utilized.
And perfect segue, because now we're going to go into staffing, and basically what everybody wants to talk about is kudos to staff and kudos to staff. Well, your staff isn't happy. So kudos to staff isn't enough, and it's been going on for far too long. You guys are board members. You're not cheerleaders. So a 5-0 vote to put this evaluation in place and this massive 98-page report, it was stunning to hear the lack of true conversation, and further stunning to see what isn't discussed and what maybe is implemented. We'll see, but we shouldn't have to wait to see and guess. It should be transparent, as they're recommending. And so far, I'm not sure I see that. Do you see that, Susan?
You know, I have read the marketing piece that was put out for the strategic plan, but it doesn't answer the nuts and bolts questions that I would have at a policy and procedure and implementation level. And, you know, I used to be an operations director at one point in my life, so I really want to see how all the pieces connect and flow. And what we get is sort of, again, the shiny object, the glossy, you know, marketing piece.
Right. It's back to politics over people. I mean, we're celebrating a couple percentage points maybe of a gain in one grade level, but we need to be having a more comprehensive conversation. And these things should not have been hidden from the public. They should have been discussed publicly instead of in one-on-ones. And don't talk about how meaningful and important and how many things are boondoggles, and then not even discuss them when they're not included in this report. So I'll let you move on to staffing, but I think we need far more than kudos to staff at every board meeting.
So staffing, I think they're acknowledging, is a challenge in most school districts across the country. in large part, if there's a nationwide shortage of education professionals, especially in special ed. And, I would say we need to, at a national level, really look at why don't people want to be in education? We aren't going to go there today, but it is, a pressing question. But if we look at it at a micro level here in our county, if you don't feel like you have the knowledge, information, training, resources, support, respect, clarity to do your job, it is hard to attract new people when that's the, advertisement that you're getting. Come be a teacher.
Well, and when you don't really want to look at the real reasons people are leaving and you don't do exit interviews, you can make up any narrative why people are leaving. We've had mass exodus of really good teachers and nobody's asking them why, really. They're just posting personal reasons or moving out of district. But if they really wanted to understand this, they could. So I can only say they don't, but
So we're going to just acknowledge that finding qualified people is a difficult thing. And so making it attractive to get the best people in your district is something we should be focused on.
right. But when you get them, do what you can to keep them.
Correct. It's always more efficient to keep people in seats than have to be looking for new people.
Right. And I think that is one area that we don't do well with any exit interviews. Now I understand we've got a change in leadership again in that area, but I know we just did an audit. The audit committee just got an audit about HR, and they didn't look into retention, recruitment, or why people are leaving, or the number of people that were leaving.
Well, and in this report, it says the current process for determining staffing needs in Sarasota is antiquated and is not a best practice for staffing a school district.
Shocking.
So I think we really need to look at that. Staffing formulas, the ratios that were developed in the past are not intuitive or user-friendly. The formulas appear to be a combination of basing staffing needs on prior year numbers, student to staff ratios, a gut feeling about what staffing should be, and a determination of what the budget will allow.
Right. Well, and that is a sticking point with me, because for years and years, we could see the budget down to the school level detail. So we could see what was going on at the schools. We could see how many teachers they had, how many ESE teachers they had, how many paraprofessionals they had. We could see the detail and we could track the trends, because you know what the enrollment is. And that has all been taken away. We can't see that anymore. And I think it's wrong. You've got a taxpayer funded budget. You should be able to see what your priorities are. That should be your first and foremost priority, is how are you going to staff these schools so these children can be educated appropriately. And then I think they morph to say that the job postings aren't clear. And they
right.
don't.
Well, and I think before we leave this, it's important to say the principals get to suggest their staffing needs, but ultimately it was primarily administered at the central office, particularly by the ESE department. So even if you had a principal that said, we've got this population of children and we need this level of staffing, they were not the ultimate decision maker.
Right.
That, that's important for parents to understand as they're deciding what school to choose and how to advocate for their individual child's needs. You need to understand the power structure of who can say yes and be able to stand behind the yes that they said.
Right.
So in this, they just talk about that each building is unique. You have different student populations and different staffing needs, and those should be considered instead of a blanket formula. They should really look at the individual needs of each school, and you need input from the people that are in that building to help decide how to do this appropriately. So recommendation 2.1 was to develop a new staffing formula that updates the staff to student ratios and accounts for the uniqueness of the student population within each school building, with ultimate staffing allocations determined collaboratively among building leadership, the ESE department, human resources, and the CFO. Focus area 2 is recruitment and retention. I think we touched on this a little bit already. I'm going to skip to the recommendation. Create job postings that are clear, accurate, and detailed to fully describe the positions being filled. Strategically expand outreach by developing additional relationships with colleges and universities in the region, and develop a robust mentoring program for newly hired special education staff who have direct student contact and provide mentor support for the first 2 years of employment. So I think to your point, Sue, let's get good people through the door, but then let's do what we can to keep them here and make sure that they have what they need in order to become, the next generation of educators that are going to serve our children.
Right. Important to know, parents, we've got long-term subs in a lot of our schools, which is something you need to be aware of. Not saying that long-term subs, there are not some very qualified long-term subs, but long-term subs in positions that are teaching special needs children is concerning.
The other thing that I guess I want to touch on before we leave this section is paraprofessionals. I can tell you that for special needs children in particular, paraprofessionals, or aides as we sometimes call them, are vital to our children being able to meet the expectations in classrooms. And having people who, I'm just going to read exactly what they say, that as you're hiring paraprofessionals, you must be honest and have a complete discussion of the job roles and responsibilities during the interview process. Without this, potential candidates do not have a complete picture of the job they are taking, which may lead to frustration, burnout, and resignations. And they talk about this more in section 2.4. But I think if you have a child that has a disability and you've put supports in place for that student, and then all of a sudden that person, we bring somebody in, it doesn't work out, they didn't really know what they were getting into, and then they leave, and then we do it again, that is very detrimental to the child. And so improving this hiring practice for paraprofessionals is really important in the day-to-day operations of the classroom. I just feel so strongly that the role that aides and paras play, we need to get the right people in the door. We need to give them the tools that they need to do the job, and we need to continue to support and mentor them so that we don't have that revolving door.
That's right. Give them appropriate training, support, all those things.
You and I've been in meetings and we've asked, hey, could we put staff training in the IEP for them? And it's not always been received with, yes, that's a great idea. There's been a lot of resistance to writing that down. And besides writing it down, it certainly isn't happening.
Oh, Susan, we do that through osmosis.
Right? Focus area 2.3 was compensation. And I'm going to skip just for time purposes. You guys, if you're interested in that, it's all right there. Yep. But they want us to consider continuing incentive pay for special education staff in the district, providing additional compensation for staff at Oak Park, and consider adjusting Paraprofessionals right now, there's 2 different grade levels, an SSP 5 and an SSP 7. They want us to consider more equitable compensation to retain greater numbers of special education staff in Sarasota. And I think they talk about collapsing those, like making one classification.
Well, they actually, this was the only one that I recall. They said the district was ahead of the game on. That's my note.
The continuing the incentive pay. Yes, having incentive pay is something Sarasota came up with because they were having a hard time attracting people in certain positions.
Well, and then we had people recommending to teachers to let their certification drop. So that was another problem we had here locally. But that
Okay.
isn't in this report. We won't talk about that.
Okay. You like throwing those little curveballs in. And so focus area 2.4 is where they really dug deep into this paraprofessional issue. And again, I'm going to skip to the recommendation. Describe the role of the paraprofessional accurately in the job descriptions and during the interview process, and provide onboarding with on-site school visits and robust training so that paraprofessionals fully understand their job responsibilities prior to their start date.
Right.
I could stand up and cheer. If we implement this one, I will be a happy camper because again, it's an on the ground directly with students impact immediately if we can get this right.
So for finance and budgeting, Susan,
Yep.
I have a clip of what Todd talked about with finance and budgeting. Do you want me to play that to kick this off, or do you want to do a little bit of background?
Yeah, no, I don't want to do any background. I think people can guess what finance and budgeting is about. So let me stop sharing that screen. We're back online. Say hi to all of our folks. And then I'll let you go ahead and play the clip. Maybe.
I'm trying.
Is it the one with the blue at the top?
Can you play it?
The first line there is the actual federal grant revenue that was received, the IDEA funding that the district received. When we start back at the far right in 2019, you'll see that there was a gap in funding there of about $879, I believe it was $878,000. And we sometimes see that in school districts, or we see that we're pulling money from the general fund to cover some special education expenses. That's not necessarily unusual if we have new curriculum coming in, if we need particular equipment or what have you. We'll see that. That's not necessarily an unusual thing. Where it becomes a little bit unusual is we see that year over year, where that continues to happen. And not only does it happen year over year, that's expanding year over year. So we're now pulling more money out of the general fund to cover our special education programming that the IDEA grant isn't funding any longer and isn't sufficient to fund. Again, if we saw that as a small amount on an annual basis, that might be something that wouldn't raise eyebrows. But when we see, and you look at that chart, that graph rather, below, you see that's a pretty exponential increase on an annual basis, year over year, of that trajectory of an increase coming out of the general fund to cover IDEA and student ESE services. Excuse me. That's something that needs to be considered. The question becomes why, and is that we are not sufficiently putting together our IDA grant application? That could be a possibility. We also know that we have expanding costs. There's no doubt about that in special education and everything else. But that type of a trajectory, when you see that going up $1 million plus nearly every year since 2020, that's a cause for concern. That's something that needs to be examined, and we need to look a little bit deeper why that's the case.
So we ring the alarm bell. We talk about this crazy exponential amount of money that is being moved. We don't know the why of it, and nobody asks a single question at all.
So I will say that Tom Edwards, at the end of this, the one question he did ask was about why did we have to make this transfer of funds? I'm not sure that he got a sufficient answer.
They said they didn't look into it. They didn't look at the complete budget. They don't know why. But why is he asking the vendor? Why wouldn't he be asking his employee to say, figure this out and get back with me? And why didn't any of them? I think Bridget Ziegler at one point said, oh, maybe the audit committee should look at that finding. But that's a podcast for another day. We'll tell that story.
Yeah. So I'm going to switch back to the report so we can get through this section.
Well, I think my next thing talks, if you want to read 3.1, what they recommend, but I've got also the soundbite for 3.2, which will set you up for that. Are you going to read the recommendation?
Yeah, I'm going to lean over and read this off to folks. I'm not going to switch the screen, so just give me a minute. But the recommendation for 3.1 was to initiate and complete a review of the ESE department finances, including the matrix of services, as well as the special education budgeting and spending, particularly as it relates to IDEA funding and the transfer of general fund revenue into the IDEA budget. So can you tell people in English what that means?
So special education is funded differently based on the services students receive, based on the level of service student receives. And what they are recommending is a complete and thorough investigation of how we're funding ESE, what we're spending on ESE, and what we're doing with general education funding. So looking at the complete budget in its entirety and drilling down and figuring out what are your priorities, because you'll see later in the report, priorities come into play. If you're funding, if you're paying your bills with money that you're not sure you're going to have tomorrow, that's a slippery slope. So looking at the budget in its entirety is what they're recommending. And are they doing the grants appropriately, asking the federal government for the money they need to support ESE services in Sarasota County? Figuring out what the problem is what they're recommending.
Right. And just so it's two different pots of money. There's the IDEA dollars that come from the federal government specifically for special education. And then there's our general education revenue. And the question is, why isn't the money we're getting with the IDEA budget enough to cover what we're doing in special education? Where's the disconnect?
Well, and the question I have too is what ESE in Florida, students that are gifted fall under the ESE allocation, and we get extra money from the state with students that are gifted. So where's that money going? And we've got a huge population. We've got an entire school here of students who are gifted. So the question is, how is that money commingled?
And it's important for folks to know that in the federal, under IDEA, it does not include gifted. But in Florida, under ESE, it does. And there's something called the general allocation, general revenue allocation, that it's like a complicated funding formula, but gifted and some of our disability dollars all come into the district through the same pot of money at the state level. So it's really important for people to kind of be able to follow the money.
Exactly. And right now it's a very fuzzy path, and we can see pieces of it, but we can't see it in its entirety. And when you ask a question, they're like, oh, you'll see it in July. Well, in July, they're going to talk about a millage for Sarasota.
Just so you know, it is July.
Well, they're saying, I think the meeting's scheduled in a couple of weeks, but
I'm saying, you said we could see it in July.
Well, people have told me they've asked our new superintendent, and he has told them they will see the budget in July. Sure, they can see pieces of it, but when you're new to this, and what I think sometimes people count on is people not understanding. Again, we're saying we're transparent, but are we transparent? If I show you a piece of this, have you seen it? That's what we need to talk about in this community. So do you want to finish up 3.2?
I do. Hang on just a minute.
Because I know you've got a meeting in just a few minutes. That
Cautionary tale, I guess, than anything else. And it's something that we wanted to bring to the board's attention. I'm sure that we know that your superintendent and his team are well aware of this, but it's something that we think is important for you all as board members to know as well, and you probably already do, is that the ESSER dollars that we received as a result of the COVID-19 are coming to an end. It truly is a cliff at this point at the end of this school year. Many times when we have federal grants, we see a step-down process. That is not the case here. It is an abrupt stop at the end of this school year. You have almost $800,000 that you've been receiving over the years on an annual basis in those. And the district in the past made a decision to use most of those dollars for staffing. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's not inappropriate per se. It didn't violate anything. However, it is problematic now. Now we have folks who have been in the schools for several years, who are embedded in the practice and the life of that school, who are one of two things are going to be the case. Either those positions are going to need to be eliminated, or the districts are going to need to reallocate resources to cover those positions. Neither of which is a great option. And so our recommendation here is really more of something for you all as a board to consider moving forward. That as we look at federal grants, we should be living within our means, not covering staffing, but instead utilizing those dollars to for any number of things. But when there's a cliff involved, not having staffing as a part of that. As a part of that process.
concerning.
Amen.
Yeah, amen. Well, and very concerning, because the most recent budget meeting we had, that's exactly what they were recommending. They were recommending staffing funded by referendum dollars. And
So explain, referendum is not a federal grant, because he was very specific that if federal grant dollars that are going to stop shouldn't be used for staffing. But why they're similar is that referendum dollars are not guaranteed dollars either. If the community does not vote to continue the referendum dollars, and we don't have a guarantee that they will, that we have had referendums in the past that have not passed. And so if you have staffing tied to not guaranteed recurring dollars, then you wind up in the same situation that as Todd was describing with the ESSER dollars, where
Right.
there's going to be a sudden stop.
Well, and I think the sudden stop here in Sarasota are the amount of money, $800,000 or something a year, that they were paying an outside vendor to come in and provide behavioral therapists to students as support for those students. And they've made a change now, so we'll have to see how that pans out. More cluster sites are being added to different schools, but there's not been a communication or a public conversation about how they're going to supplement those therapists that are not funded anymore by the ESSER dollars. Again, we don't see a budget. We don't have those talks publicly, but similar to what you're saying, Susan, the referendum dollars the vote is coming up in November. And I haven't had a chance to tell you this yet, but I saw on the district calendar, obviously it's a priority because they've got on the district calendar meetings that they're setting up right now at different school sites to talk about the referendum. And we've got a lot of new parents here. And the way they promote that is going to be, we need this money because it's funding these staffs. And we want parents to understand, while we say we need schools to be funded appropriately, be transparent with us and show us the budget and show us where your priorities are and where the money's really going before you start asking us for more money. Don't count on us just giving it to you, because that could be devastating for our students. So a lot of the things in this report need to be taken seriously. We need to have public conversations. We need parents to understand this, because as Todd said, we're falling off a cliff at the end of this school year.
And the only way for there to be accountability for government agencies, and a school district's a government agency, is for stakeholders to ask the hard questions. if citizens and parents and staff don't say what's working, what isn't working, where are we spending our money, did you follow recommendations from a report that you paid 150,000 of our dollars to have done? We know what happens.
Yep.
What happens is we have, more than 50% of our children who aren't proficient readers. When you get to looking at our special education students, those numbers grow exponentially. And so if we want student achievement to be what Sarasota delivers to kids in our community, and we want parents who come here for an A-rated school district to actually have an A-rated experience, we have got to make sure that all of our dollars and our staffing and our priorities and our initiatives and our communication is aligned with increasing student achievement.
Absolutely. Very, very well said. And I know you've got a meeting to go to. Should we resume this again on Thursday and hopefully try to finish up this report?
Yeah, I mean, I know we'll get through the next, few sections at least. It's ambitious to believe. I think we're gonna get through all of the rest of it. But just so anybody who's tuning in, section 4 and 5 are really deep topics, and I think we want to make sure that we
That's true.
talk about them thoroughly, and make sure that people understand what was communicated and hopefully what will be incorporated in the new strategic plan that the superintendent's bringing forward.
And 6, curriculum.
Yeah, curriculum. But I just think that these are deep topics. We want to give them their due. So please join us again on Thursday, and we'll keep going on this report. And if you have questions of what things we've already talked about, please leave it in the comments. We would be happy to talk about those and go into more depth if there's questions.
And thank you for joining us. And thank you for making this a priority for your kids and other kids.
Thanks. Have a great day. Bye.